Welcome to session 77 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This time around, it's a continuation from last month's, where we started with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, Books 1 and Book 2 by Steven Erikson. This time, we are continuing this, looking at Memories of Ice, which is Book 3 in the series, and House of Chains, which is Book 4. Now, of course, there's a lot more left since there's 10 books in this entire series, but you can tell by looking at these are some pretty substantial tomes, so we're not going to try to go through the entire series any more than we did in the previous session, but we are going to dig into these pretty deep. And if you're new to this series, what Worlds of Speculative Fiction is, it's a series that I started back in 2016 as an in-person, face-to-face lecture, discussion, talk series focused on world building and philosophical themes in great works by authors in fantasy and science fiction and horror and alternate history and utopia and dystopia, all the things that figure into this vast panorama of speculative fiction. And we would pick a series of novels, novellas, short stories that actually have a common narrative universe that we could explore. Eventually, when COVID hit, we went online, and it took the form that you're seeing now, which is a video which we premiere with live chat, runs anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes. Then we follow it up with a conversation through video conferencing. You can leave comments. You can join us for this event. Hopefully some of you are watching this as it premieres right now, and we get to have some really great discussions. And, I have to say, this is one of those fan-recommended series that I probably would have never have encountered or read on my own, and I am so happy that I did. I want to give a special shout-out to Jimmy Nuts, who I've gone on his show. He's come on mine as well at various times to talk about all sorts of things, not just with Steven Erikson, but also with Philip K. Dick and other authors as well. But he and some of his fans, followers, were very important in raising this author and this series to prominence. It is an amazing high fantasy series that is great literature in so many important respects. So buckle in. We're going to talk about all sorts of things in this really cool world in which the Malazan Empire is, the new kid on the block, so to speak. There's a lot of things for us to go into in terms of the world building, in terms of the characters, narratives that are going on, and in terms of grand philosophical themes that we find beginning in the first two novels and then continuing on with some new ones introduced in books 3 and 4. At the very beginning of the previous session video, I said something that now I need to revisit and not completely take back, but certainly qualify in a way. So there were quite a few people who were saying, as I was approaching this Malazan Book of the Fallen series and going into Book 1 and Book 2, oh, you're not going to understand what's actually going on until you get to Book 3. It's not going to make a lot of sense. and you're going to need to use the Malazan wiki. That's going to become your best friend. And so here's what I said at the time. I was like, well, I read book 1 and book 2, and I found that they were, not perfectly comprehensible. There's a lot going on in all of them, a lot of moving parts, a lot of characters, a few things that do remain murky. But I'm not encountering that difficulty that people are talking about, which stems from having so many different point of view characters, so many plot points, Stephen Erikson's own way of writing and all of that. I could understand what was going on in the narrative most of the time and figured I could always go back and reread. So that is true, and that was accurate. But I see now, I think, what some people were driving at in talking about Memories of Ice, because when you actually do read this book, and I think you can also say that to a certain extent about House of Chains, although perhaps less so than about Memories of Ice, the picture, the panorama is certainly expanding, so it's getting wider. It's also getting longer. There's more races, more back history, more narratives, more, let's call it metaphysics of how the world actually works in terms of the magic. If you want to call it a system, I'm not sure that it actually is a true system, but maybe it is. There's an awful lot that is being revealed in Memories of Ice that really adds to our picture, particularly with respect to the pre-human races that come to play more and more of a massive role within not just the story itself, but all of the backstory, the narrative. So, do I take it back? I don't take it back entirely. You can, in fact, read book 1 and book 2, Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates, and make sense of them as great novels in their own right, as the first glimpses, actually not even glimpses, first long looks at this amazing world that Stephen Erikson is developing. But there is so much more being brought to the story in Memories of Ice that I can now understand why people were saying things like, oh, you're not going to really get what's going on or understand what's happening until you've read the third book. That's kind of true as well in a way. It's not so much that you're not going to understand it. So they misspoke a little bit, but rather you're going to have understanding on this level, and then there's understanding on this level, and you keep on going up and up and up. It's not a great metaphor, I would say, because it's not so simple as stratified levels. Although, interestingly, Erikson does think of these things archaeologically. Actually, that gets discussed, not in terms of archaeology per se, but using archaeological metaphors in both of these books by some of the characters who are thinking about these matters. And we get to see new sides, new developments, new interactions with some of the key point of view characters who come up over and over again. So there's so much more added to the picture. And I'll also say, House of Chains, we are getting more races coming into the picture, at least with some of them. We're learning more about the backstory, the grand panorama of, not even millennia, but eons of development in this world. And we're also getting to see that within the races, they're not monolithic. There's a lot of differences between people belonging to these different groups. I mean, humans are probably the race that has the greatest diversity of perspective and faction and opinion and projects. But even among the Imas, the Tlanimas in particular, or the Tista races, or the Jaghut, or some of the others as well, the Toblaki that we're seeing, the Telemen playing a key role in this as well. There's a lot of interesting variance that is taking place. Now, before we jump in, I think that I don't need to do biography in this one because we did enough biography of Erikson last time, and he's still a living author, still working, so not a hell of a lot has changed in the month since I did the last of these sessions devoted to books 1 and book 2. I don't think that we need to spend as much time on looking at what Erikson himself says about his world building, about the characters or things like that as we did. We spent a lot of time on that in the previous session, so I don't think we need to devote too much time to that, which means that this session can be a lot more about exploring the world building that's going on in more depth, in more detail, talking about some of the important characters and what's happening with them, and looking at some philosophical themes, maybe a wider array of them than we did last time, as some of them become more, let's say, I was going to say important, but let's actually say prominent and well-developed in these next 2 novels. So that is what we're going to do. Let's jump into talking about world building and some of the really key, cool things that are being revealed in these 2, you want to call them novels? Let's call them tomes, given how dense and thick they actually are. In Stephen Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen series, I think you can say that you don't have world building first and then character and then plot, but all 3 of these come together, and the world is never revealed as a totality in any given place. We have to piece together an account, and we expand that world based on what happened in the first 2 novels, what was revealed in the first 2 novels, massively in these 2. So there's a lot of different vantage points by which we might approach it, and none of them suggest themselves as the single one that we would have to pick. So that gives us a certain freedom, but also gives a certain arbitrariness to any choice that we're going to make. So you could criticize what I'm going to do here on 2 accounts. One would be that there's no way that we're going to cover every single facet just that's revealed in these 2 books. It's simply not going to be possible in a video of this length. It would take us video after video after video. But you could also criticize based on the choice of what to focus on, what to emphasize, where to start, and what direction to go in. And so, in a certain way, these are stories that do have, you can't say a completely linear structure and narrative to them, but they do have a beginning and a middle and an end, and they go in one way, although there's a lot of looking back over the past as well, and a lot of going back and forth, either in narrative as told by Erikson, where the characters are interacting with each other, or by what the characters themselves are saying or recounting or revealing. So there's a lot of that. But even choosing what to emphasize is going to be, a controversial sort of choice. So when I was thinking about this, I was looking for metaphors that we could use for a narrative that is this rich and complex and, I won't say self-referential, but where the parts are referring to each other so much. And, a mosaic comes to mind, a tapestry comes to mind. Neither of those are particularly effective, perhaps because they're two-dimensional. And this is not just three-dimensional. There's certainly the factor of time, but there's so many other things going on as well. I don't think there is a useful metaphor. You may try to suggest some if you want. So I'm going to pass over that and begin with an admittedly rather arbitrary starting point, saying both of these are stories that are not reducible to, but are certainly given a core, a structure, by two military campaigns, just as we could say with the first two. The campaign in Deadhouse Gates, the Chain of Dogs, Let's Save These Civilians, all of that sort of stuff. Gardens of the Moon, the contest that's going on for the city, involving eventually bringing another race in, the Joghut Tyrant. So in these, what is Memories of Ice about? There's a new threat that has been rising, and we're going to see, and this is kind of an old story, isn't it? We're going to see enemies coming together in order to combat the greater threat. So the enemies of the first novel, right, represented by essentially the two main sides, are going to team up. Now, this is facilitated by, of course, Dujek One Arm being outlawed, and which is actually not the case. He's still working for the Malazan Empire, but that allows him to connect up with Anamander Rake and with Caladan Brood and all of these other groups that are going to fight with each other against the Panian Domin and the Seer. So that's, a significant story. But there's all these other things woven in through it as well. And that's happening largely on one continent. Then we have House of Chains, of course. And this is another military novel about the Malazan Empire. And it's the aftermath of the Chain of Dogs. There's a new adjunct who has arrived, who's going to lead a Malazan army to punish those who, revolted, who abandoned, who betrayed the empire, and who ended up destroying both the Chain of Dogs and the army that stupidly surrendered under a very foolish high fist. And we get to see both camps with this. We get to see the Malazan camp as it's advancing. We get to see the forces of Shaik and the whirlwind goddess and the uprising against the Malazan, which includes some traitors as well. Now, okay, so that is part of the story, right? And a significant part of the story. And we could say backdrop. But there's so much else going on as well. Why is this called House of Chains? And we already get to see the beginnings of this hinted at, being revealed to some degree in Memories of Ice. Well, because there is this god, the chained god, the crippled god, the one who, as we find out in the very beginning of Memories of Ice, fell from the sky. And maggots that came out of his flesh became the great ravens, magical creatures that live for eons. He is manipulating things behind the scenes and affecting things, even in Memories of Ice, poisoning the Warrens. And we see that the role of the gods and ascendance is going to be massively important. We're going to see rearranging of what we could call a pantheon. One god is going to go out and essentially be replaced by another god. Very important to a mercenary company. And we've got that going on, and we've got all sorts of involvements of not just humans fighting each other, but non-human races that are all in some ways connected with each other, either biologically or through how they fought against each other or, dominated each other or things along those lines as well. And so we've got this incredible panorama looking backward, not just thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps even further, on this massive continent for which there exists still no official map, but plenty of maps that Erikson has said, yeah, that'll do, that works. Now, there are maps, of course, provided in these books, as he typically does, which show us what this continent is like or what this continent is like. So that's all, you might say, preface to this. We have a massive world with lots of actions taking place, lots of plans at, counter to each other, flowing into each other, connecting with each other, informing each other, clashing with each other. The main continents here are going to be Genebacus and Seven Cities. There's some others mentioned, but those aren't the only locations, because we have warrens as well that one can go into, and they are like their own worlds onto themselves. So for anybody who might be coming to this kind of new, the magic system in these Malazan stories is rather complex, never revealed as an entire whole, but we get to see a lot of its workings from the very first book into these. So think of a warren as a dimension, a magical land, a land that magic comes out of into the world that we inhabit, or the Malazans and all the other human beings and other races inhabit. So the warrens can be called upon to do certain kinds of magic. There's a warren, humans can access certain warrens, and each sorcerer or mage, or pick whatever other kind of magic user, is usually connected with one. Quick Ben, actually, through a very interesting fluke that we find out about in the backstory in one of these books, can do 12 and deploy up to 6 or 7 at a time. That makes them kind of special. There are warrens that are only accessible by certain races, or at least until humans are able to do that. Warrens can be broken, scattered, reunited, and there's a warren of chaos that doesn't have any sort of order, and it wiggles and worms its way around all the other warrens. And warrens can be good places. They can also be crazy places. They can be scary places. They can be going beyond scary to terrifying places. And they can have effects on the people who not only use them, but travel through them. And they often do allow going from one place to another. Even the Empire, the Malazan Empire, has an imperial warren that its mages will use. But there's warrens corresponding to all of these high houses as well, as we're going to get into in just a bit. So that's part of the story. And there's many kinds of magic. Not all magic happens through warrens. As a matter of fact, there are spirits of the land that possess power. We see that there are gods that basically are like their own warren, and they, interact in some cases with their worshipers through particular people who could be the mortal sword or the shield anvil of that god, and act on behalf of that god and be inhabited by them. There's also other, things going on as well. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, none of which, again, are ever revealed all at once. There's no data dump in these books where one of the characters says, and here's how all of the Warrens work, right? You have to piece it together. There's no appendix in the back that explains the entire system either. Even the Malazan Wiki, which is faithful to the books, can't tell you everything in any one single entry. So that's really quite wonderful. There's also, as we find out, and we found this out in Deadhouse Gates, there is a ore and a metal that can be mined and refined called otateral, that we find out as well that it's used in the blood oil that the Teblor use both as sort of an aphrodisiac, but also to make their wooden swords incredibly sharp, dangerous, and resilient in House of Chains. And that's going to be a very important aspect as well. There are what we call shapeshifters. Here in this book, they're called solitaken if they verge into a single thing. And usually when they verge into it, it's something scary like a dragon or a panther. And then there are the divers, who are even more powerful, who can turn into swarms of spiders or rats, or even, as we're going to find out, hounds. That's going to be quite important. There's a revelation that the Hounds of Shadow were actually, at one point in time, a divers. There's all sorts of magical beings, demons that can be harnessed and brought to do things. Often some of them have quite a bit of initiative of their own. I mentioned the ravens, which we'll talk about in just a bit. There are gods, some of which are very, very ancient. I'm going to read you a passage in a bit that talks about some of the elder gods. And then there are ascendants, not only human beings, but other beings, particularly the Imas, wind up becoming godlike. They wind up gaining power. And you can't easily become an ascendant. It's not something you aim at directly. So, that's a significant part of it. We should also mention that there are what are called houses, right? So in the back part, you get a sort of, with a deck of dragons. Think of the deck of dragons as sort of like a tarot deck, and it's got different houses or suits, And here's the main ones. You have life, death, two diametric opposites, right? Light, dark. Now, light didn't come first. Dark came first, and then light came after that, and then after that came shadow, right? And then you have the House of Chains. That's going to be playing a role. Is it a new house? Can it actually exhibit its own power? Is it outside of the deck? Will it be in the deck? And then you have unaligned people. We encountered the Jesters of Chance, who don't play much of a role in these books. We have Burn, this deity who lives within the earth, who's sleeping. And we're going to have a master of the deck fairly soon, as a character who we encountered already in the first book and who's carrying through, Captain Paran, right? Who is of the same house that Felison comes from and the new adjunct comes from as well. So this is quite important. The two houses that are really playing the most important role in this are the House of Shadow, which, as it's going to turn out, the Malazan Emperor and his buddy mage assassin, Kalanavad and Cotillion, are going to become, well, Cotillion is his name, the rope, right? Are going to become ascendants and take over Shadow. But Shadow has been around a lot longer than that. As a matter of fact, we find out that the Shadow Warren part of it is accessible to humans. Not all of it necessarily is. We'll talk about that when we get to races in a bit. And then we have this new house of chains, essentially run by the chained or crippled god. One of the fairly important characters, who I'll read you a passage about shortly, winds up becoming the king of that house. And we have a whole bunch of other people being recruited, including probably the most important character of House of Chains, Karsa Orlong, a Telomen, or Thelomen Toblakai person, we'll get to that in a moment as well, who are going to be quite important in this story. So we've got all these things going on as well, and these are kind of at odds with each other. House Death will play a significant role in this, not least because everybody winds up going there sooner or later. Not everybody. Most people, if they die, wind up going through Hood's Gate, right? And then I mentioned we have Perron, the master of the deck, who didn't ask for this role, but winds up with it anyway, and he has to make a very important decision about whether to allow the House of Chains into the deck to become a legitimate house. We'll get to that in a moment as well. So those are some significant things to mention. We should also talk about races and the immense backstory that's still playing a massive role. So let's start with humans, right? We know about them. You and I are humans. Where did humans come from? Well, in our world, we evolved from apes. In this world, we actually evolved from an earlier sentient race, the Imas. And we evolved from the Imas that didn't engage in this massively, what should we call it, earth-shaking ritual that turned them into undead warriors and set them on a path that would keep them alive unless they were destroyed or unbound in certain ways for eons. So we humans are kind of Johnny-come-latelys on the scene, you could say. But we've also been around for a long, long time in this story. And there's a first empire, a first human empire that we'll talk about. There's also another empire that was sort of foisted upon the world. And here's where we should, we'll come back to this in just a moment. I need to tell you about other races as well. So we also have races that are more close to us humans, that are the Thelomen Toblaka, but they're much larger. They often have more organs. They're stronger. They heal quicker than we do. And this would include the Fen and Trell, who we've already encountered in the previous books, and in this case, the Teblor, who are going to play a massive role in House of Chains. Along with them, we have you could call them hybrid races that developed from a mix between the Imas and the Thelomen Toblakai, the Barghast, who are going to play a massively important role as warriors in Memories of Ice. We're going to encounter quite a few of them. And then the Moranth, who we already encountered previously as allies of the Malazan Empire, fighting for them. They continue to fight, at least some of them do. And the Moranth and Barghast are enemies to each other, but are actually related to each other. Then we have another race which is essentially descended from humans, but appears to be, in some respects, different. The Segula, they play a significant role in the party with Lady Envy in Memories of Ice, and Tok the Younger, and all of that. But they are a distinct grouping, right? They are this incredibly martial and hierarchical race that will fight against they'll fight against anybody, including themselves, but are going to fight against the Panion Domin. I mentioned the Imas, and we encounter the Tlon Imas, those who underwent the ritual of Telon and became undead so that they could continue a war. And not all of the Imas did that. As a matter of fact, some of them missed the ritual, some of them weren't around for it, and they became other groups. But there's still a lot of Tlon Imas left, and they're an older race. And yet there are even older races. Why did the Tlon Imas emerge from this ritual? Because there was an even earlier race, the Jaghut. And the Jaghut were, for the most part, rather individualist. They didn't form into communities. Why? Because when they did, they found that it involved people controlling each other, and they didn't like that, except for those who had a taste for that. And they, those tyrants, as they're called, when the Imas were just a young race and very impressionable, the Jaghut tyrants essentially passed themselves off as gods and controlled and did whatever they wanted to the Imas. So the Imas fought against the tyrants, and the tyrants had incredible magical power. They're associated with ice and snow and are quite strong. And so what ended up happening is the Imas, waging this war, are losing it. So they decide to undertake this ritual, which will turn them undead, and allow them to continue this war, a war that becomes one of extermination of all of the Jaghut, trying to kill not just the tyrants, but any of that race. We find out that there are two other earlier races, one of which we're only going to see a little bit of, and that's going to happen in House of Chains, and that is the Forderil Asail. And these are, again, quite powerful in relation to the other races. As a matter of fact, there's the three greatest Teblor warriors, including Karsa Orlong, are going to release this Forderil Asail who's been stuck underneath a rock for who knows how long, millennia. Still alive, it gets up and knocks the crap out of all three of them, giving one brain damage and then hurting the other two before it takes off. But what we find is really quite important, and the oldest sentient race that's native to this land, we encounter in Memories of Ice. And this is a less humanoid and more reptilian race, the Kachin Chamale, who are going to play a significant role, at least certain of them, in fighting in this war. So that's a lot of races already, right? It gets more complicated yet. And so in the first two books, we encountered quite a few of the Tisti Andi, and they originated in the Warren of Dark, and they were the children of Mother Dark. When she, out of loneliness or something, creates more, and we wind up with light and then shadow, they don't like that. They emerge into this world, but they're not originally from it the way that these other races appear to have originated here in this world. We find out in Deadhouse Gates that there are other Tiste. So we encounter grayish ones. And so the Tiste Andi are black-skinned, often with white hair. The Tiste Edur have gray skin, and they are connected with shadow. And we don't really get to see many of them early on, but we get to meet one and spend time with him in passages we're going to look at shortly in House of Chains. And we see quite a few of them fighting as well. And then we have yet another one, the Tista-Liosan, who are of light. And they're kind of, you could say genocidal on their own terms. They don't like the other Tista. They don't really like many people at all, but they view the others as essentially degenerate. They have white skin, and they, dress in white lacquered armor and all that. And each one of them is a people that live for a very, very long time unless they're killed, and have their own particular motivations and have differences of viewpoint among them. So we're going to find that all of those play a major role. What else do we need to talk about in terms of backstory before reading a little bit of passages? Well, you're going to notice references to the First Empire. So the Malazan Empire is a very new thing. It's about, by the time that we're in these books, a little over 100 years old. Kelenavad and Dancer were the ones, along with a coterie of other people, formed it, created its armies, its way of doing things, its bureaucracy. So it's actually relatively recent. There was an empire prior to that, long before that, called the First Empire, that conquered entire continents. And there were Tlan Imas who didn't really like that. The First Empire broke apart in part under its own weight. It splintered and degenerated into a whole bunch of things. But one of the things that Kelenavad has been able to find is the First Throne, which allows him to control one of the clans of the Tlan Imas, which he uses in judiciously in his contests. We encounter other clans besides the Logros. The Kron, for example, play a significant role in Memories of Ice. As a matter of fact, we're going to find that they actually have a certain kind of redemption going on as well. But we find out that other Tlan Imas are going to play an important role. As a matter of fact, one of them didn't actually become a Tlan Imas, but remains just an Imas, and that is Kilava, who we encounter at the beginning of Memories of Ice, and later on, near the end of Memories of Ice. She saves two Jaghut children and protects them, at least she thinks she's doing so, from the Tlan Imas who want to exterminate them. She sends them into what she thinks will be a safe alternate dimension. Turns out, didn't work out quite so well. But we have other important characters as well. Her brother Onos Tulan, or Tool, who we encountered in the very first book, he becomes friends with a human being, with Tak the Younger. And he is going to be involved in the destruction of the Paneon Domin and going after the seer. We also have the person who, and he, Kilava is his sister. The mate of Kilava is going to play a role in this as well. Auroch, who depicted Kilava, which you weren't supposed to do, in a cave painting. And we're going to find out that the whirlwind goddess, who is so important in House of Chains, who is driving the revolt against the Malazan on that continent in Raraku, is actually a Tlan Imas, who felt herself abandoned by Auroch, and in her anger, in her hate, became consumed by that. We also find out that there are renegade Imas, the seven faces, those who are worshipped by the Teblor in House of Chains, who are encountered, who are renegades being pursued by the Logros clan, right? They're called the Unbound. And so it turns out that it's not just humans who ascend or, beasts or things like that. It's also the Amas who play an incredibly important role within this world. So I would like to read you a few important passages. This one comes from Memories of Ice, and they are encountering these undead K'chain Shamale, who are these, essentially giant lizard creatures who, believe it or not, in place of hands, have swords. And so they are real badasses. They attack and they just chop. Well, that's because they are actually part of the warrior caste of that highly regimented society. And they have been brought back to life from their barrows. So we have this interesting discussion taking place between some of the war leaders on the combined Malazan, Onamander Rake, Caladan Brood alliance against the Panian Domin. And so here we go. Dujek nodded and growled. Corlots described what the scouts found. Anything else to add? Whiskey Jack glanced at the Tista Andi, but her expression was closed. No, High Fist. Corlot and her king seem to know more about these K'chain Shamale than the rest of us. What lies below are a jumble of shattered bones, some weapons and armor. I could not have identified themselves. The Rivi scouts believed they were undead. Fortunate for us all, muttered Calor, who we're going to read about in just a bit. I am not so ignorant of these creatures as the rest of you, barring Kolot. Further, I am feeling unusually loquacious. The remnants of the K'chain Shamale civilization can be found on virtually every continent of this world. Indeed, in the place of my old empire, Jakaruku, their strange mechanisms filled pits and holes in the earth. Whenever my people had to cut below the surface, they discovered such constructs. More barrows were found. Scholars conducted careful examination of their contents. Do you wish to hear of their conclusions, or am I boring you? Go on, Caladan said. Very well. Perhaps there's more wisdom here than I'd previously credited. The beasts appear to be reptilian, capable of breeding their own kind to specific talents. Those the Tista Andi called Kel hunters, for example, were born as warriors. Undead versions are in the valley below. Yes, they had no hands, but swords in their stead somehow melded to the very bones of their forearms. The K'chain Shamale were matriarchal, matrilineal. As a population of bees have their queen, so too these beasts. She is a breeder, the mother of every child, and within this matron resided the sorcerous capacity of her entire family. Power to beggar the gods of today. Power to keep the elder gods from coming to this world. And were it not for the self-destruction of the K'chain Shamale, they would rule unchallenged to this day. Self-destruction, Korat said, a sharpness in her eyes as she studied Collar. An interesting detail. Can you explain? Of course, among the records found once the language was deciphered, and that effort alone is worthy of lengthy monologue. But seeing as all you shift around in your saddles like impatient children, I'll spare the telling. A little bit of a side note there. That's Erikson, who could have told us more, but, he wants to keep the action moving. Among the records found, it was learned that the matrons, each commanding the equivalent of a modern city, had gathered to meld their disparate ambitions. What they sought beyond the vast power they already possessed is not entirely clear. Then again, what need there be for reasons when ambition rules? Suffice it to say an ancient breed was resurrected, returned from extinction by the matrons. It was a more primitive version of the K'chain Shamale themselves. For lack of a better name, scholars at the time called them short-tails. Whiskey Jack, his eyes on Corlat, was the only one to see her stiffen at that. Behind him, he could hear Silver Fox and Crippa making their way back up the slope. For the singular reason, Collar went on in his dry monotone, that they physically deviated from the other Kachin Chamale in having short, stubby tails rather than the long, normal, long, tapered ones. This made them not as swift, more upright, suited to whatever world and civilization they had originally belonged to. Alas, these new children were not as tractable as the matrons were conditioned to expect among their brood. More explicitly, the short tails would not surrender or merge their magical talents with their mothers. The result was a civil war, and the sorceries unleashed were apocalyptic. To gauge something of the desperation among the matrons, one need only travel south on this continent to a place called Morn. The rent, Corlott murmured, nodding. Collar's smile was wintry. She sought to harness the power of the gate itself, but not simply a common Warren's gate. Oh no. She elected to open the portal that led to the realm of chaos. Such hubris to think she could assert order upon such a thing. He paused as if reconsidering his own words, then laughed. Oh, a bitter lesson or two in that tale, don't you think? So, there's a little bit more to this as well that ties in with the immediate story. So, he says, Caladan Brood says, let's bring this back to the present, shall we? In the valley below, undead Kell hunters. The question to address is, what are they doing here? They are being used. Everybody's eyes fixed on Silver Fox, who stood before her horse, reins in hand. I like not the sound of that, Dujak growled. Used, Silver Fox repeated, by the Panian seer. Impossible, Caller snapped. Only a Kachin Chamale matron could command a Kell hunter, even when undead. Then it would appear, said Corlott, that we have more than one enemy. The Panian seer has an ally? Dujak leaned on his saddle and spat. There's not even been so much as a hint. Nonetheless, Silver Fox cut in, proof lies before us in the valley below. A matron cannot breed more of her own kind without the seed of living males, Caller said. Therefore, with each Kell hunter destroyed, there's one less for us to deal with. Brood turned at that, his eyes thinning to slits. Easily swallowed, this revelation. As we're going to find out, the matron is coupling in a certain way with somebody. Now, I'm going to read you one other passage from Memories of Ice. We mentioned Collar already. So we have something important that's bringing together a number of different players in this. This is happening 119,736 years before Byrne's sleep, 3 years after the fall of the crippled god. So this is very back story. The fall had shattered a continent, we find out. Scattered survivors remained, reduced to savagery, wandering a landscape pocked with huge craters, now filled with murky, lifeless water, the sky churning endlessly above them. Kinship had been dismembered. Love had proved too burden costly to carry. They ate what they could off in each other and scanned the ravaged world around them with rapacious intent. One figure walked this landscape alone, wrapped in rotting rags. He was of average height. There was a dark cast to his face, a heavy inflexibility to his eyes. And we read on a little bit more. Beyond the suffering he absorbed, Krell would have willingly embraced their broken souls, yet he had was feeding on the blood spilled onto this land. And the truth was this, the power born of that would be needed. In Krell's wake, men and women, killed women, killed children. Dark slaughter was the river the elder god rode. Elder gods embodied a host of dark unpleasantries, right? And so the elder god crosses the ruined continent. He looked upon the still living flesh of the fallen god, had seen the unearthly maggots that had crawled forth from that rotting, endlessly pulsing meat and broken bone, had seen what these maggots flowed into, the broad black wings. And so he goes on as well. And Krell is, here we go. Here in Jakaru, in the shadow of long-dead Kachin Chamale ruins, another empire had emerged, brutal, a devourer of souls. Its ruler was a warrior without equal. Krell had come to destroy him. had come to snap the chains of 12 million slaves. Even the Joghut tyrants had not commanded such heartless mastery over their subjects. No, it took a mortal human to achieve this level of tyranny over his kin. 2 elder gods were converging on the Caloran Empire. The decision had been made. The 3, the last of the elder, would bring to a close the High King's despotic rule. Krull could sense his companions. Both were close. Both had been comrades once. But they all, Krull included, had changed to drift far apart. This would mark the first conjoining in millennia. He could sense a 4th presence as well, a savage ancient beast following his spoor, a beast of the earth of winter's frozen breath, a beast with white fur, bloodied, wounded almost on to death by the fall, a beast with but one surviving eye to look upon the destroyed land that had once been its home, long before the Empire's rise. Right? And so we find these 3 elder gods confront who? Kalor. And the High King says, "You've come to liberate my people from my tyrannical rule. Alas, I'm not one to relinquish such things, not to you, not to anyone. What you would refuse me, I now refuse you." It's gone. They are gone. Break the chains, will you? Go ahead. I surrender them. Here, all about you is now free. Dust, bones, all free. "You have in truth incinerated an entire continent," the sister elder whispered. "Jokeru is no more and never shall be. What have I unleashed will never heal. Do you understand me? Never. And it is all your fault." So we have, empires that have risen and fallen long before Malazan is attempting to impose its will on these continents in this world. I do want to read you one other passage that has to do a little bit with this world-building story, and then we'll jump into talking about philosophical themes. And we'll have to bring our world-building to perhaps a close, we could say. So this is where the Trollsengar, who is a renegade Tista Edur, and Onrak are, with each other. And he says, "What do you see, Tlanimas?" Shrugging, the Tlanimas turned away from his lengthy study of the statues. "There are mysteries here of which I suspect you know more than I." The Tista Edur glanced up with a wry expression. "That seems unlikely. What do you know of the Hounds of Shadow?" "Very little. The Logros crossed paths with them only once, long ago in the time of the First Empire, 7 in number, serving an unknown master yet bent on destruction." Troll smiled oddly, then said, "The human First Empire, or yours?" "I know very little of the human empire of that name. We were drawn into its heart but once," Trollsengar, in answer to the chaos of the Solitaken endeavors. "The hounds made no appearance during that slaughter. It is believed by the bonecasters that to create an icon of a spirit or god is to capture its essence within that icon. Even the laying of stones prescribes confinement. Just as a hut can measure out the limits of power for a mortal, so too are spirits and gods sealed into a chosen place of earth or stone or wood or an object. In this way, power is chained and so becomes manageable. Tell me, do the Tista Edur concur with that notion?" Trollsengar climbed to his feet. "Do you think we raise these giant statues, Onrak? Do your bonecasters also believe that power begins as a thing devoid of shape and thus beyond control? And thus to carve out an icon or make a circle of stones actually forces order upon that power?" Onrak cocked his head and was silent for a time. "Well, then it must be that we make our own gods and spirits. That belief demands shape, and shaping brings life into being. Yet we're not the Tista Edur, fashioned by Mother Dark? Did not your goddess create you?" Troll's smile broadened. "I was referring to these statues, Onrak. To answer you, I do not know if the hands that fashioned these were Tista Edur. As for Mother Dark, it may be that in creating us, she but simply separated what was not separate before. Are you then the shadows of the Tista Andi, torn free by the mercy of your goddess mother? But Onrak, we are all torn free." Says, "Two of the hounds are here, Trollsengar. Their souls are trapped in the stone, and one more thing, their likenesses cast no shadows." nor do the hounds themselves. If they are but reflections, then there must be hounds of darkness from which they were torn. Yet there is no knowledge of such, that Tlanimas suddenly felt silent. Trull laughed. It seems you know more of the human First Empire than you first indicated. What was that tyrant emperor's name? No matter, we should journey onward to the gate. Decemblacus, Ornrak whispered, the founder of the human First Empire, long vanished by the time of the unleashing of the beast ritual, which created the Solitaken and the Devers. It was believed that he had veered. Devers? Aye. And beasts numbered? 7. Trull stared up at the statues and gestured. We didn't build these. No, I'm not certain, but in my heart I feel no empathy. They're ominous and brutal to my eyes, Tlanimas. The hounds of shadow are not worthy of worship. They are indeed untethered, wild, and deadly. To truly command them, one must sit in the throne of shadow as a master of the realm. But more than that, one must, now notice this, first draw together the disparate fragments, making curled Emerlon whole once more. Now this is the older warren of shadow from which the Tista Eder are emerging. And this is what your kin seek, Onrak rumbled. The possibility troubles me. The Tista Eder studied the Tlanimas and shrugged. I did not share your distress at the prospect, not at first. And indeed, had it remained pure, perhaps I would be still standing alongside my brothers. But another power acts behind the veil in all of this. I know not who or what, but I would tear aside that veil. Why? Trull seemed startled by the question, and then he shivered. Because what it has made of my people is an abomination, Onrak. And he says, I imagine you know little of what it is to see your kin fall into dissolution, to see the spirit of an entire people grow corrupt, to struggle endlessly to open their eyes, as yours have been opened by whatever clarity chance has gifted you. And he says, it's not mere naivete. Our denial is willful, our studied indifference conveniently self-serving to our basest desires. We are a long-lived people who now kneel before short-term interests. If you find that unusual, the Tlanimas muttered, then it follows that the one behind the veil has need for you only in the short term, if indeed that hidden power is manipulating the Tista Eder. Who is that hidden power? The ruler of the House of Chains, the crippled god, the chained god. So we see all of these important things coming together, this massive historical, archaeological, anthropological backstory with magic mixed in and all sorts of other great, vast wars and empires. And all of these things are impacting the present. In fact, what we're going to find by the end of the House of Chains is all of these important characters being brought together in one place that is, you might say, calling them. In the desert, Raraku, where the whirlwind goddess has been living within a broken warren that other gods, the chain god, for example, is seeking out. So, who's the true enemy? Who is working behind the scenes? All of this is important stuff to sort of work through. And as we're going to find, the big baddie of Memories of Ice, the Panion Seer, is going to be a Joghut, the Joghut child who's talked about at the very beginning, who has developed a sort of hateful, nihilistic point of view. But this is being driven by the crippled god. And we're going to find that Kalor himself will get sucked into the wake of the crippled god. So we have all of these vast things going on within this world as it is being spelled out, revealed, structured for us to enter into imaginatively. But now let's concentrate a little bit less on the vast panorama and more in on characters and plots and themes of what's going on in these important stories. I think that one of the grand philosophical themes that now we can see developed more in these two Malazan novels than perhaps they were in the previous ones, but not completely spelled out for reasons that we'll talk about, is the complexity and the contingency of what we might call evil, which is not a term that gets used an awful lot within these Malazan Book of the Fallen novels. Erikson isn't that sort. It's not as if there's a bunch of people wearing black hats or black armor and then white over here, the good guys and the bad guys fighting each other. But it's clear that there is better and worse, and that the good characters are never entirely good, but the bad characters are complex, at least some of them. I mean, there are terrible people who delight in killing, and maiming other people, depriving them of parts of their flesh. There's cruelty of various sorts. There's the need to resist things that seem just completely malevolent, right? But often even these, the hounds are a great example. They begin and they're scary as hell, right? But it turns out that they're not just malevolent beasts. And we're going to find that with a lot of different main characters who are really driving things, or even we could say forces, who have the potential to be set up as the big baddie. It's not quite so simple. Even the crippled god himself, who in these two books is in fact behind the scenes in a lot of ways and driving things. If we want to say there is a dark lord or a great villain or something like that, a big boss, it would be the crippled god. But even that doesn't completely figure in as it would in some other fantasy literature. So we should talk about the Panion Domain and the Seer, as we're going to meet him in Memories of Ice, harnessing the Kachin Chamele, matron and undead, and doing things to not just particular characters, but an entire bunch of cities, nations, peoples, actually sending warriors and emissaries off to other lands, commanding obedience. And then we should also talk, I think, about the whirlwind goddess, who we encountered before in the second novel, right? Set on the same continent, the Seven Cities, as House of Chains. But we get to know so much more about her in this. So Dead House Gates to House of Chains. So let's talk about what is happening. There's this alliance that's being formed to attack the Panion Domain. Why? Because they are terrifying. They are a new culture, a new religion of faith that essentially worships and inflicts death. And so we see this reference. Crone, the great raven, is saying, "My children spy upon the Panion Domain. They can smell the power rising from those lands so thoroughly sanctified in blood. Yet it remains faceless, as if hidden beneath layer after deceiving layer. What hides at the core of that empire of fanatics?" And so that's the question. We know that there's a seer, some sort of religious figure. There are septarchs, these rulers of the seven territories. We know that there are vast armies of regular soldiers, but also people who are so driven by hunger and poverty and a desire for inflicting death that they will engage in mass wave attacks as well. And so we read a little bit later on here, a wholesale slaughter they're talking about. Every damned one of those priests should be belly smiling. It's the only way to deal with this Martyrs to the faith, Cherryh responded. A direct attack is doomed to fail as it has in other cities. This conflict is one of information lords and ladies, or rather misinformation. The priests, that is the priests of the seer, are conducting a campaign of deception. The Panian domain, for all its imposition of law and order, is a tyranny, characterized by extraordinary levels of cruelty to its people. No doubt you've heard tales of the Tenescauri, the seer's army of the dispossessed and the abandoned, and all that you may have heard is without exaggeration. Cannibals, rapers of the dead. The children of the dead seed, one man spoke up, leaning forward. Is it true? Is it even possible that women should descend onto battlefields and soldiers whose corpses are not yet cold? Cherryh's nod was somber. Among the Tenescauri's youngest generation of followers, aye, there are children of the dead seed, singular proof of what is possible. The domain possesses its sanctified faithful, the citizens of the original Panian cities to whom all the rights and privileges the priests speak of applies. No one else can acquire that citizenship. Non-citizens are less than slaves, for they are the subjects, the objects of every cruelty conceivable without recourse to mercy or justice. The Tenescauri offers their only escape, the chance to match the inhumanity inflicted upon them. The citizens of Saltwin, should the domain subjugate the city, will be one and all cast from their homes, stripped of all possessions, denied food, denied clean water. Savagery will be their only possible path as followers sworn into the Tenescauri. And so what is he talking about there? This is an army that effectively reproduces its own conditions upon the conquered, drawing more of them into its embrace and using them as troops who will kill or die and then butcher and eat the corpses. We find a little bit later there's a discussion here. The shield anvil, Octavian says, the threat from the south comes from an empire called the Panian Domain, ruled by the seer immortal man. But there's something else going on there. The reports of these Kachin Chamali are recent developments, while the expansion of the Panian domain has been underway for some years now. And then Pranchola says, Octavian, this word Panian, has it a particular meaning among the natives? He shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. Panian, the bone caster, said, a Joghut word, a Joghut name. And this is going to be quite important. As it turns out, the Panian seer is not a human being, not a mortal man. He is a mortal being, but he's one of the few remaining Joghut who are hunted and are still being hunted to extinction by the Tlan Imas in a genocide that began eons ago. And we're going to find out more and more about this person as time goes on. Unfortunately, Tolk the Younger gets captured and gets turned over to the ally of the Panian seer, the matron, who is one of these, ancient creatures, who turns out to have been imprisoned and then released from her prison by the Joghut, right? So what is she doing? She's nearly insane, and she is constantly doing things to Tok, right? So we find, here we go, the cycles of his life. Sleep, then wakefulness, punctuated by hallucinations, smeared scenes of figures in golden sunlight, delusions of being a babe in his mother's arms, suckling at her breast. The matron possessed no breast, so he knew these to be delusions, but he was sustained by them nonetheless, and times when he began voiding his bladder and bowels, and she held him out when he did this, so he fouled only himself. Then she would lick him clean, a gesture that stripped him of the last shreds of dignity. Now, that's not the worst part. Here it is. Her embrace broke bones. The more he screamed with the pain, the tighter she held him. He had learned to suffer in silence, his bones knitted with preternatural swiftness, sometimes unevenly. He knew himself to be malformed, his chest, his hips, the blades of his shoulders. Then came the visitations. A ghostly face sheathed in the wrinkled visage of an old man. The hint of gleaming tusks took form within his mind, yellowed eyes that shone with glee fixed on his own. The visitor would speak to him. "They are trapped, my friend, all but the Tlanimas who fears solitude. Why else would he not leave his companions, swallowed in ice, helpless, frozen? The Segale, no need to fear them, never was. I but played, and the woman, my rhymed, beauteous statue, wolf and dog have vanished, fled, I, the kin, brother of your eyes, fled, tail between his legs. Your Malazan army is too late to save Kapustan. The city is mine. Your fellow soldiers are still a week away, my friend. We shall await them. We shall greet them as we greet all enemies. I will bring you the head of the Malazan general. I will bring you his cooked flesh, and then we shall dine together, you and I once more. How much blood can one world shed? Have you ever wondered, Toke the Younger? Shall we see? Let us see then, you and I and dear mother here. Oh, is that horror I see in her eyes? Some sanity still resides in her rotted brain, it seems. How unfortunate for her." So, a little bit later, "Deceit, they are not mortal beasts. How dare they assail my defenses? Here at the very gates, and now the Tlanimas has vanished. I can find him nowhere. Does he come as well? So be it, they shall not find you. We journey, the three of us, north, far beyond their reach. I have prepared another nest for you too." And so we're getting to see what the seer is actually like. He's cruel. He says, how much blood can I make the world shed? And that is, what is happening there because of this project, this desire to inflict damage, to make people eat each other that's going on. A little bit later, the seer had wanted him to see. Coral, the palace fortress, often assailed. His vast cordon of mages, the 1,000 or more K'chain Kamale hunters, the elite legions of his main army. The defeats to the north meant little to him. Indeed, he would yield Seta, Lest, and Moorcock. He would let the invaders to their long, exhausting march. It goes on and on and on. The seer was well satisfied, said the nameless seer Domin, pleased enough to yield to Toke this momentary mercy, out from his mother's arms. And so he's going to talk with the seer Domin a bit. And he says, "You should have seen Coral in its day, Malazan. It was your home, wasn't it? Aye, though now my home is in the heart of my seer." This is a man who's committed in his faith. "Where the winds are even colder," Toke muttered. The seer Domin was silent for a moment. Toke was expecting a blow from a gauntleted fist or a painful wrench from the hand gripping his frail arm. Either one would have been an appropriate response. Either one would have elicited an approving nod from the seer. Instead, the man said, "This is a summer day, but not like summer days I remember in my youth. Coral's wind was warm, soft, caressing as a lover's breath. My father, he fished out beyond the cut, up along the north coast of here, vast rich shoals. He'd be gone for a week or more with every season's run." Toke glanced up at the man, saw the smile, the glittering echo of a child's joy in his eyes, saw them die once more. He came back the last time to find that his family had embraced the faith. His wife to the Teniscowry, his sons to the ranks, eldest begun schooling as seer Domin. He did not throw his lines to me on that day, seeing my uniform, seeing my mother, hearing her mindless shrieks, seeing my brothers with spears in hand, my sisters naked and clinging to men thrice their age. No, he swung the boom tacked onto the offshore breeze. I watched his sail until I could see it no more. It was my way, Malazan, of saying goodbye, Toke whispered, of saying good luck, of saying, well done. Destroyer of lives, seer, this is Toke thinking to himself, how could you have done this to your people? Well, the answer is because that's exactly what the seer wants. He wants destruction in as much modes, with as much intensity as possible, to use the very things that will destroy to destroy more, to turn people into mere things. And so at the very end, the seer is captured, and we find out he was one of the Yaghut children who had been captured had been taken by the merciful, although he didn't see it that way, Imas, who put him and his sister into the rift. And then he managed to get out. And so what we find out is that he's bound, and he tells her, the Imas, "You should have killed us the first time. I remember you. Your lies." This tells you something very important. He thought that she was not actually trying to save him, that she instead was trying to cause even greater harm. So she tells him, "Your sister is still there. Her soul seals that wound. It's the way Warrens heal themselves to keep from bleeding into each other. The first time it was the matron, the Kachain Shamale. Times come, seer, to send her back. Hood knows what that that contains the power and the mind of the matron, will do once you release it, once you send it into that rent." The Yaghut managed a ghastly smile. "To free my sister? To what? You fool, you blind, stupid fool. Ask the Bonecaster, how long would we survive in this world? The Tlan and Mus will hunt us in earnest now. I free my sister to what? A short life filled with flight? I remember, mortal. I remember running, never enough sleep, mother carrying us, slipping in the mud. And oh, how I remember you, Bonecaster. You sent us into that wound." "I was mistaken," the woman said. I believed it was a portal into Omtos Felak, which is the warren where the Yaghut could have lived." "Liar, you may be flesh and blood, but in your hatred for the Yaghut, you are no different from your undead kin. No, you discovered a more horrible fate for us." "No, I believed I was saving you." "And you never knew the truth? You never realized?" Paran watched the woman's expression close, her eyes flattening. "I saw no way of undoing what I had done." "Coward!" the Yaghut shrieked. And so this is the problem they're posed with. And she ends up saying, "Yaghut, better that you be cut down by the Imas than an eternity of pain such as your sister is now suffering." And they actually come up with a way of dealing with this. Quick Ben has a solution, which we don't need to go into. But where did all of this evil, this hatred, this power to destroy come from? From being hunted, from being seemingly betrayed, having all of your kin taken away from you, a desire to impose that same destruction and evil onto the rest of the world, onto weaker creatures that could be corralled. In House of Chains, we of course do have the Chain God, who we'll talk about elsewhere. But I want to talk about the Whirlwind Goddess, because we learn a lot about her in the second half of the book, right? So one thing that's particularly important, and we learn this through Felison, Shaik, the new Shaik reborn, the barrier itself defines a warren, the warren that lies like an unseen skin over the holy desert. This location is a magical warren, or at least a fragment of it. This usurped fragment is a fragment no longer, but a whole unto itself, and its power grows until one day it will demand its own place in the deck of dragons, as with the House of Chain, a new house, that of the whirlwind. So there's an ambition there. There is a raw desire for power, for dominion, for domination. And when she fed by the spilled blood of a slain army. And when she kneels before me, what then? Dear sister, broken and bowed, smeared in dust and far darker streaks, her legions of ruin behind her, feast for the cape moths and vultures. Shall I then remove my war helm, reveal to her at that moment my face? We have taken this war away from the rebels, away from the Empress and the Malazan Empire, away even from the whirlwind goddess herself. We have supplanted, you and I, Tavor, Drina and the Book of the Apocalypse for our own private apocalypse, right? So this is how Felison gets drawn in. A bit later, we read this. Something was coming, bestial and wild with power, and with each passing moment as it grew nearer, Loric's fear grew. Loric is this high mage who's, as it turns out, one of the Tisti Leosan, the son of Osric, in fact. So what do we hear? Ancient wars, such as the feel of this, as of an enmity reborn, a hatred that defies millennia. And he sensed that no one mortal in the oasis city was the subject of that wrath. The truth remained that we are all in the way. And he says, he should flee this place, take Felisian and probably Haboric as well with him. And yet a curiosity held him here for the present. These layers are splitting, there would be truths revealed, and he would know them. I came to Raraku because I sensed my father's presence somewhere close. And then, he's going to find out what's actually going on. The whirlwind goddess is going to be beginning her wrath. And this is going to happen through Shaik/Felison, who is going to challenge her sister, the adjunct Tavor. So we read here, have I any choice in this? The goddess remained a towering presence in her mind, rooted through every muscle and fiber, her voice whispering in the flood of the flow of blood in her veins and arteries. Ascendant power was within Shaik's grasp, and she knew she would use it when the time came, or rather, it would use her to kill my sister. Right? So the goddess is trying to get her to do this. And he tells her, or she tells him, the goddess protects me. I have nothing to fear. And he says, Shaik, there will be a convergence this night. None of it matters, Loric. I cannot be touched, nor will the goddess be denied. He stepped closer, his eyes wide. Chosen one, Raraku is awakening. What are you talking about? Can you not hear it? The rage of the goddess consumes all, Loric. If you can hear the voice of the holy desert, then it is Raraku's death cry. The whirlwind shall devour this night, and any ascendant power foolish enough to approach will be annihilated. The goddess Loric will not be denied. And so what is this going to look like? Well, very close to the end of the book, we're going to find out who the whirlwind goddess is. The whirlwind goddess had once been a raging storm of wind and sand, a wall surrounding the young woman who had once been Felison of House Paran and who had become Shaik, chosen one and supreme ruler of the army of the apocalypse. And then we learn about Felison, her mother, and the talent that she had. Her mother had been gifted with visions. This was well-known and respected truth, and that mother's youngest daughter had dreamed that one day she too would find the talent within her. But that gift only came with the goddess, with this spiteful, horrific creature whose soul was more parched and withered than any desert. And the visions that assailed Shaik were murky, fraught things. They were, she had come to realize, not born of any talent or gift. They were the conjurings of fear, a goddess's fear. And now the whirlwind wall had closed, retracted, had drawn in from the outside world to rage beneath Shaik's sun-darkened skin along her veins and arteries. Oh, there was power there, bitter with rage, bilious with malice, and whatever fueled it bore the sour taste of betrayal, a heart-piercing, very personal betrayal, something that should have healed, should have numbed beneath thick, tough scar tissue. Spiteful pleasure had kept the wound open, had fed it festering heat until hate was all that was left. Hate for someone, a hate so ancient it no longer possessed a face. In moments of cold reason, Shaik saw it for what it was, insane, raised to such extremity she understood that whatever had been the crime against the goddess, whatever the source of the betrayal, it had not earned such a brutal reaction. The proportions had begun wrong from the very start, leading her to suspect that the proclivity for madness had already existed, dark souls marring the soul that would one day claw its way into ascendancy. Step by step we walk the most horrendous path, stride tottering along the edge of an unsuspected abyss. Companions see nothing amiss. The world seems a normal place, step by step, no different from anyone else, not from the outside, not even from the inside. Apart from that tautness, that whisper of panic, that vague confusion that threatens your balance. Hatred, sweet as nectar. I have walked into that abyss. I am as mad as that goddess, and that is why she has chosen me, for we are kindred souls. So, what are we going to find out at the very end of this as Shaik challenges her sister, and she thinks that the goddess is going to take possession of her and kill her sister and put an end to the Malazan army. So we find out the goddess had not lost her memories. Indeed, rage had carved their likenesses, every detail as mockingly solid as real seeming as those carved trees in the forest of stone, and she could caress them, crooning in her hatred like a lover's song, lingering with a touch promising murder, though the one who had wronged her was, if not dead, then in a place that no longer mattered. The hate was all that mattered now, her fury at his weaknesses. Oh, others in the tribe played those games often enough. Bodies slipped through the firs from hut to hut when the stars fell in their summer alignment, and she had more than once spread her legs to another woman's husband or an eager, clumsy youth. But her heart had been given to the one man with whom she lived. That law was sacrosanct. But he had been so sensitive, his hands following his eyes in the fashioning of forbidden images of that other woman there in the hidden places. He'd used those hands to close about his own heart, to give it to another, without a thought as to who had once held it for herself. Another who would not even give her heart in return. She had seen to that, with vicious words and challenging accusations, enough to encourage the others to banish her forever. Who is that other? The Imas who took the two Jaghut. But not before that bitch killed all but one of her kin. Foolish, stupid man to give his love to that woman. Her rage had not died with the ritual, had not died when she herself, too shattered to walk, had been severed from the vow and left in a place of eternal darkness. And every curious spirit that had heard her weeping, that had drawn close in sympathy while they had fed her hungers, and she had taken their powers, layer upon layer, for they too had been foolish and stupid, wayward and inclined to squander their power on meaningless things, but she had a purpose. The children swarmed the surface of the world, and who was their mother? None other than the bitch who had been vanished. Vengeance, that was a beast, long straining at its chains. Vengeance was all she had ever wanted. Vengeance was about to be unleashed, and even Raraku could not stop it. The children would die. Now notice this and think about the similarity to the Panian seer. The children will die. I will cleanse the world of their beget, the proud-eyed vermin, one and all of that single mother. Of course, she could not join the ritual. A new world waited within her. And now, at last, I shall rise again, clothed in the flesh of one such child. I shall kill that world. She could see the path opening, the way ahead clear and inviting, a tunnel walled and spinning writhing shadows. It would be good to walk again, to feel warm flesh and the heat of blood, to taste water, food, to breathe, to kill. And then we find that the goddess is herself going to be attacked. And then just a few pages later, The goddess was keening a wavering, eerie cry that did not pause for breath, and it seemed to Lorek she was struggling. She had stumbled into a web of vines, the twisted ropes entangling her arms and legs, wrapped like serpents around her torso and neck. He wondered that he had not seen them earlier, realized they were flickering. At one moment there, the other gone, though less an impediment for their rhythmic disappearance. They were changing into chains. Suddenly one snapped, and the goddess howled, redoubled her efforts. Another broke, whipping to crack against a tree. Lorek edged forward. Goddess, hear me shike. She's not strong enough for you. My child, mine. I stole her from the bitch. Mine. The high mage frowned. Who? What bitch? Goddess, listen to me, please. I offer myself in her stead. Do you understand? And a voice spoke low behind Lorek. Interfering bastard. Right? And what ends up happening? The goddess shrieks as the first knife was driven into her back. He watched them kill her, a prolonged, brutal butchering. Corbelo's talons, his chosen assassins, guided here by febrile, abetted by sorceress powers. She fought back with a ferocity near to match, and soon 3 of the 4 assassins were dead. But more chains now ensnared the goddess, dragging her down. And Laura could see the fires dying in her eye sockets, spirits writhe away, suddenly freed and eager to flee. And the last killer darted in, hammering down with his knife through the top of the skull. And this is what they end up doing, destroying the goddess. You see that the chains are part of this as well. And you see in these 2 figures, the Pantheon seer and the whirlwind goddess, what it is that hatred, betrayal, a feeling of being entirely on your own and subjected to the cruelties of others can, in certain beings, become vast motivating forces, driving world events. So that's one of the key themes, I would say, that we get to explore through narrative in these stories. Another one of the key philosophical themes that I wanted to highlight in these 2 novels in particular, some of which is traversing the first 4 books more generally, are what we can call positive emotional affects, attachments, actions. You know, we have armies fighting with each other. We have these vast power struggles going on. There's a lot of instances of hatred, of cruelty, of domination, of trauma being revisited, of rivalry. But we also get to glimpse this incredibly, and I'm not just going to say human side, since it's also shown in quite a few of the other races involved as well, including the Tista of different sort, and the Imas, whether Tlan or not, and some of the others as well. So I think this is really worth highlighting. And what I want to begin with in talking about this is a theme that Stephen Erikson has said is really central throughout the Malazan works, and that is he discusses it as compassion or empathy. And I think we can also use another word that we see coming up, mercy, but we can also talk about care and concern as well. And there's many instances of this, but I wanted to highlight several in particular. So the one that I'd want to begin with is actually in Memories of Ice, and it has to do with this character Octavia, who is an officer in the Grey Swords, who are a mercenary company, but they're not an ordinary one. They are devoted to this god of war, and they have these different important ranks in there. Gods will have various people who are sort of their stand-in. So this is Fenner, and Fenner is going to essentially lose his godhood in the course of this, and the Grey Swords, who are fighting against the Pananin Domin under almost impossible odds to try to save this city of Kapustan, hired by the prince, are there to not just fight, but to fulfill kind of a religious function, a quest, right? They're going to eventually find new gods, the twin wolves, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And one of the things that happens with Octavian when he loses his god and the gray swords are decimated and then they're rebuilding them and he passes on his title is he's going to get connected to the Tlan Imas who are gathered. They've been summoned by this composite being who we're also going to talk about, who includes a Tlan Imas bonecaster, Tattersail, and a few other people. And she gathers all of these Tlan Imas there, and they fulfill a really important purpose, fighting against the undead, warriors that have been summoned by the Panian seer to fight on his side. But he is going to do something that shows incredible compassion. So this happens very late in the Memories of Ice. I'm going to read you this passage. Benediction, godless he could not give it, not in its truest form. But he had not comprehended the vast capacity within him, within a mortal soul, to take within itself the suffering of tens of thousands, the multitudes who had lived with loss and pain for almost 300,000 years. So pause on that. Think about what it would be like for a being to have experienced loss, suffering for 300,000 years. Now imagine an entire legion of these people. He saw faces, countless faces, desiccated eyes, nothing more than shadowed pits, dry, torn skin. He saw bone glimmering from between layers of root-like tendons and muscles. He saw hands chipped, splintered, empty now, yet the ghosts of swords lingered there still. He was on his knees looking out over their ranks, and it was raining, a wavering deluge accompanied by reverberating groans, splintering cracks, filling the darkness above. He looked upon them, and they were motionless, heads bowed, yet he could see their faces, every face, every face. I have your pain. Head slowly lifted. He sensed them, sensed the sudden lightness permeating them. I have done all that I am able to do, yet it was not enough, I know, yet I have taken your suffering. You have taken our suffering, mortal, into myself. We do not understand how, and so I will now leave you. We do not understand why. For all that my flesh cannot encompass, we cannot answer the gift that you have given. I will take it with me. Please, mortal, somehow, the reason, please, that you would so bless us. I am the mortal. Your pardons, sirs. You wish to know of me? I am a mortal, as you say, a man born 3 decades ago in the city of Erin. My family name, before I surrendered it to Fenner's Rev, was Atenthalion. My father was a hard, just man. My mother smiled but once in all the years I knew her. The moment when I departed, still it is the smile I remember. I think now that my father embraced in order to possess, that she was a prisoner. I think now that her smile answered my escape. I think that in my leaving I took something of her with me, something worthy of being set free. Fenner's Rev, in the Rev, I wonder, did I simply find for myself another prison? She is free within you, mortal. That would be a good thing. We would not lie to you. Itkovian Otenthalion. She is free and smiles still. You have told us what you were, but we still do not understand your generosity, your compassion. And so we ask again, why have you done this for us? Sirs, you speak of compassion. I understand something now of compassion. Would you hear? Speak on, mortal. We humans do not understand compassion. In each moment of our lives we betray it. We know of its worth, yet in knowing, we then attach to it a value. We guard the giving of it, believing it must be earned. Tlan Imas. Compassion is priceless in the truest sense of the word. It must be given freely in abundance. We do not understand, but we will consider long your words. There is always more to do, it seems. You do not answer our question. No. Why? Because I was the shield anvil, but now I am done. And this concludes, and beneath the moon's torrential rain, he died, having taken on all of their suffering, becoming a vessel for it, freeing them with nothing being granted to him in return. He liberates an entire people, and he's buried with great honor by them afterwards. Another really interesting example comes up with one of the main point of view characters, and indeed very important players in this, who we essentially begin the book with, Karsa Orlong, who is pretty merciless, right? He's like the toughest of the tough guys, and kills not just all sorts of human beings and other humanoid races, but even gods. So we're going to encounter him as he runs into the Tlanamas, who have been essentially masquerading as gods for his people, these renegade Tlanamas who are working for the crippled god and the new House of Chains. And he's going to have an exchange with one of them that is going to turn out quite bad for her in some respects. And here's what happens. I need to find the page. So he encounters all 7 of them, and they want him to join the crippled god. And he is confronting them. And Sabala says, "We failed to once long ago, such things cannot be undone. Thus you must surrender to it, or may surrender to it, and so suffer beneath its eternal torment, or you can choose to free yourself of a burden." Karsa Orlong, our answer to you is simple. To fail is to reveal a flaw. Face that revelation. Do not turn your back on it. Do not make empty vows to never repeat your mistakes. It is done. Celebrate it. That is our answer, and indeed is the answer shown us by the crippled god. And he says, "To the crippled god I now give my answer." And what is his answer? He cuts her in half. The edge taking Sabala between left shoulder and neck, bones snapping as the massive blade plowed through diagonally across the chest, severing the spine, down and through the ribcage, sweeping clear just above her right hip. She had lifted her own sword to intercept it, and it had shattered, flinging shards and slivers into the air. So the ruined form that was Sabala collapsed in clattering pieces onto the stone floor. The Tlanamas had been cut in half. And what we find out is she lives still. The warrior grunted, "I heard you Tlanamas were hard to kill." "Impossible, Karsa Orlong. We persist. Will you leave me here? There is to be no oblivion for you. Once long ago a sea surrounded these hills. Such a sea would free me to the oblivion you speak of. You return me to a fate and a punishment I have spent millennia seeking to escape. I suppose that is apt enough. What of your new master, this crippled god? He has abandoned me. It would appear there are acceptable levels of imperfection and unacceptable levels of imperfection. I have lost my usefulness." Now notice what Karsa says. "Another god that understands nothing of what it is to be a god." And what he does is he pushes her head, shoulder, and arm into his pack and draws the strings once more and carries him with her. Towards the end of the story, he is going to show her something and show us and himself something that demonstrates to us he's no longer the same person he began. He's still, super badass, but he's learned something important. He goes to the sea and he takes Sabala's face out of the pack and says, "Tell me, what do you see?" "My past," a moment of silence, then, "all that I have lost." The tabloid released his grip and the partial corpse collapsed into a cloud of dust. Karsa found his water skin and drank deep, and then he stared down at Sabala. You once said if you were thrown into the sea, your soul would be freed, that oblivion would come to you. Is this true? Yes. With one hand, he lifted her from the ground and walked towards the sea's edge. Wait, Teblar, wait, I do not understand. Karsa's expression soured. When I began this journey, I was young. I believed in one thing. I believed in glory. I know now, Sabala, that glory is nothing. Nothing. This is what I now understand. What else do you now understand, Karsa Orlong? Not much, just one other thing. The same cannot be said for mercy. He raised her higher, then swung her body outward. It struck the water in the shallows and dissolved into a muddy bloom, which the waves then swept away. So we see that this great warrior who's, able to fight supernatural beings and kill them has now realized that glory is empty, mercy is not. Compassion is another word for mercy. There's a third instance that I'd like to bring up, and it's that of Cotillion with the woman who he at one time possessed as Sari, who then took on another name. She was originally a fisherman's daughter. She takes on the name Opslar and retains her capacity for assassination. And the young man Crocus, who we encountered already in the very first book, who is in love with her and has taken on his own new name, Cutter. And Cutter has become a devotee of the House of Shadow, and in particular of Cotillion. And we find that there is this connection which really cannot be properly fulfilled. Opslar knows that, here I'll read it too. She knows that she's more than one person, and she wonders which woman Crocus had fallen in love with. She has Cotillion come and says, would you rather I left you bereft? Bereft, Cotillion, no, innocent. And Cotillion says, innocence is only a virtue lasts when it is temporary. You must pass from it to look back and recognize its unsullied purity. And so they're talking back and forth, and she talks about the love that she knows that Cutter has for her, but which her is it? There are two women within me. Two? There are multitudes, lass, is what Cotillion says, and Cutter loves them all. And she realizes that she has to leave, and then she says, I like him, and do you know what you have to do? And Cotillion says, I like the lad too. And she says, Cotillion, you don't seem much like a god at all. And he says, I'm not a god in the traditional fashion. I'm a patron. Patrons have responsibilities. I rarely have the opportunity to exercise them. Meaning they're not burdensome? His smile broadened. You are worth far more for your lack of innocence. Opsalar, I will see you again soon. Cotillion, she says, thank you, and take care of Cutter, please. And here's what he says. I will, as if he were my own son, Opsalar, I will. And, what a striking way of portraying things. Again, we could say so humane, right? Now, there are other important affects as well, and I brought up a love story. There are some love stories within these novels. Most of them don't work out. And the, line between Opsalar and Cutter is one of them, and they are actually together for a good portion of House of Chains, fighting against, for example, the Tista Edur, but they're not going to be able to be together, at least not at this point in the story. Who else? Well, we have a wonderful love story between a human being and a Tista Andi in Memories of Ice. Tista Andi are essentially immortal unless they're killed by something. Whiskey Jack is a man of incredible integrity, and his integrity shines through in this alliance, and Corlott falls in love with him and he with her, and they're able to, get together several times, but he is unfortunately killed while trying to intervene to protect her against the High King, who they clash with. An unhealed injury leads to Whiskey Jack's leg buckling under him, and he's killed. So, brief, beautiful moments that, end up not working out. We also have Tattersail, who has now become, part of Silver Fox, and Gamois Paran, we're going to talk about him a little bit more, who becomes the master of the deck. He and Tattersail had an affair and were falling in love when she's killed. Her coming back is an opportunity for them to rekindle this romance, but he realizes it's not going to happen. It's not possible for them anymore. We do have one kind of happy ending one. The Barghast woman, Hetan, and this character, Krupa, who talks about himself in the third person, and who turns out to be one of the most intelligent men in existence, who is being used or harnessed by the elder god Carol, right? She, as Barghast women are prone to do, essentially claims him. She says, I'm going to have sex with you. Come on. And so he does. And she's the dominant one at first, but she finds that Krupa actually loves her and desires her, perhaps even more than she does him. And he gets her pregnant. And the pregnancy survives all of this fighting and stuff like that. So that's kind of a happy ending one. And in a way, the happiest ending of all is in Memories of Ice. It has to do with these two incredibly ancient wolf gods, one of whom is a god of war, the other of whom is a god of winter. And they are lovers who are split apart from each other for millennia, but are finally brought back together, Tog and Fonderay, and they are able to be a couple again, and they become the patrons of the new gray swords as well. So we have a lot of interesting romantic love things. We can also talk about friendship, and there are some really legendary friendships like that between Anomander Rake and Caledon Brood. Whiskey Jack is actually, interestingly, there's this observation by Corlott that Anomander Rake doesn't give away friendship easily, but Whiskey Jack somehow earns it, of course, before he dies. Companionship is incredibly important in this. We have all of these people, some of whom are military, some of whom are other things, who become companions with each other and develop friendships along the way. A great example of this, in the very beginning of Memories of Ice is Tak the Younger and Onos Tulan. Onos Tulan will say, I am going after the Panian Seer because he has hurt my friend, this human, right? So even the undead can have friendships forming. The bridge burners themselves turn out to have a friendship that survives after death. They're the ones who rise up and destroy the army of the apocalypse in the End of Chains, the dead bridge burners who have become kind of ghosts. I also want to bring up familial connections, and there's not a lot of this going on in the book, but there is one that I think is particularly, I at least found it particularly heartwarming, and it's between two incredibly powerful beings. One is the High Mage, Lorik, who is a Tista Leosan, and his father, an Ascendant, Osric, who's believed to have left this realm of the Malazan empire, and he has indeed. He's been living in memories. And we see that Lorek has been seeking his father, finally finds him, and there's this interesting exchange. You know, his father is, you could say, not really a huge fan of him. So he says, "So like your mother, is it any wonder we could not stand each other's company? The third day, always by the third day, we could make a lifetime of those 3 days, exaltation, then comfort, then mutual contempt. 1, 2, 3. Lorek looked away. "And for your only son?" Osric grunted. "More like 3 bells. So his father is willing to save him, which he does as a great dragon, but he doesn't give his son his love. But what we find in the very end is a hint of reconciliation between them. Lorek is lying, dying after having been stabbed. And we find that, here we go, beneath the high mage, his lifeblood soaked the moss. It came to him that he was dying. Twigs snapped nearby. "I'm hardly surprised. You sent your familiar away, didn't you? Again." Lorek twisted his head around and stared upward and managed a weak smile. "Father, I don't think much has changed in your room, son, since you left it. Dusty, I would think." Osric grunted. "The entire keep is that, I would hazard. Haven't been there in centuries." "No servants?" "I dismissed them about 1,000 years ago." Lorek sighed. "I'd be surprised if the place is still standing." Osric slowly crouched down beside his son, the sorcerous glow of Denul now surrounding him. "Oh, it still stands, son. I always keep my options open. An ugly cut you have there, best healed slowly." Lorek closed his eyes. "My old bed?" "Aye." "It is too short. It was when I left anyway." "Too bad he didn't cut off your feet then, Lorek." Strong arms reached under him and he was lifted effortlessly. Absurdly, for a man my age, centuries. He felt at peace in his father's arms. "Now," Osric said, "how in Hood's name do we get out of here?" The moment passed. So we see that his father is coming back to this theme of compassion, care. His father, this divine being who, gets tired of his son, shows him love, shows him compassion. And that's a great way to end this particular theme. We are already at this point well over the time allotted for this video, so I thank you for your indulgence in coming along, just as people did with the previous one. But, there's so much going on in these. I just want to hit on one other theme very, very briefly. And you could call it a metaphysical theme if you want to, but it's one that has to do not just with the nature of reality, but with agency within it, and association and order and chaos. And Gamois Paran is going to be at the center of that, as it turns out, the new master of the deck of dragons. So there's a few passages that we want to look at very quickly. One is when he's in the house of the Azoth, and he's talking to this keeper of the place, and he says, "Reyes, you said the Azoth has need for a master of the deck. Why? What's happened?" The Joghood bared his tusks. "A war has begun." Paran fought back a sudden shiver. "A war involving the houses of the Azoth? No entity will be spared, mortal. Not the houses, not the gods, not you, human, or a single one of your short-lived, insignificant comrades." Paran grimaced. "I've enough wars to deal with it as it is, Reyes. They are all one." And he's looking at all of these images, and he says, carved into their bleached surfaces, these wooden, these flagstones, were cards of the deck of dragons. No, more than just the deck of dragons. There's cards there I don't recognize. Lost houses and countless forgotten, unaligned houses. And so he's finding that there's all sorts of backstory involved iconographically in this. We jump ahead, and there's another interesting engagement between the crippled god and Gethel, who is already one of the ascendants. And Gethel says, I was there for your chaining after all. And the crippled god says, behold, the house of chains. And Joghoot says, what have you done? No longer an outsider, Gethel. I would join the game. And look more carefully. The role of herald is vacant. Indeed, these are very early days. Who, I wonder, will earn the right of king in my house? Unlike Hood, you see, I welcome personal ambition, welcome independent thought, even acts of vengeance. And then he's told, the deck of dragons will resist you, chained one. Your house will be assailed. It was ever thus. You speak of the deck as an entity, but its maker is dust, as we both know. There is no one who can control it. Witness the resurrection of the House of Shadows, a worthy precedent. Gethel, I have need of you. I embrace your flaws. None among my house of chains shall be whole in flesh or spirit. Look upon me. Look upon this broken, shattered figure. My house reflects what you see before you. Cast your gaze upon the world beyond, the nightmare of pain and failure that is the mortal realm. Very soon, Gethel, my followers shall be legion. Do you doubt that? Do you? The Joghoot was silent for a long time. Then he growled, the House of Chains has found its herald. What would you have me do? So we're getting a new, as we're going to see, a term that's being used later on, a new paradigm being offered. We get an interesting discussion happening in the War Council, and Whiskey Jack is meeting with Onamander Rake and others, and Whiskey Jack says, you still need us. More than ever, perhaps, and not just your army. We need Quick Ben. We need Humbrol Tower and his white-faced clans. We need your link to Silver Fox and through her to the Tlana Moss. And we need Captain Paran. Ganois Paran, why? He is the master of the Deck of Dragons. And then Whiskey Jack says, do you know what that role signifies? A genuine question, because frankly, I don't, and I wish I damn well did. So here's what Onamander Rake says. The crippled god has fashioned a new house and now seeks to join it to the Deck of Dragons. A sanction is required, a blessing, if you will, or conversely, a denial. Whiskey Jack grunted, what of the House of Shadow, then? Was there a master of the deck around who sanctioned its joining? There was no need. The House of Shadow has always existed, more or less. Shadow Throne and Cotillion simply reawakened it. And now you want Paran, the master of the deck, to deny the crippled god's house? And Onamander Rake says, I believe he must. To grant the fallen one legitimacy is to grant him power. We see what he is capable of in his present weakened state. The House of Chains is the foundation he will use to rebuild himself. And so, they're against Paran, and they try to bring pressure on Paran to deny the House of Chains. A little bit later, Paran, who's been troubled by all sorts of stomach problems, which stem from these magical issues, he starts thinking to himself. Here we go. A storm of plans, each one trying to make me into a fulcrum. I need only spread the fingers of one hand and so encompass the entire deck of dragons, a truth I'd rather not recognize. But I feel those damned cards within me like a barely articulated bones of a vast beast, so vast as to be unrecognizable in its entirety, a skeleton threatening to blow apart unless I can hold on, and that is the task forced upon me now, to hold it all together. Players in the game, wanting no others. Players outside the game and wanting in. Players to the forefront and ones behind, moving in the shadows. Players who play fair, players who cheat. Gods, where do I begin to unravel all of this? This incredibly complex set of forces working with and against each other. And so he goes on and he says, are we just subject to some sort of determinism? Well, if that was the case, the elder gods would have taken us over already. And so he thinks about historians, and then we get, so he was to be a fulcrum, a position demanding a sudden burgeoning of his ego, the unassailable belief in his own efficacy, the last thing that I'm capable of. So he has to make this incredibly important choice. Do I let the chain god and his new house in, or do I deny them? There's one other thing that I want to bring up before we end this with his decision. So again, this is where Karsa Orlong and the Tlan and Mas, the renegades, are meeting together. And he's told this. And this is from Sabala. In its totality, stone, sea, forest, city, and every creature that has ever lived all share the same struggle. Being resists unbeing. Order wars against the chaos of dissolution of disorder. This is the only worthy truth, the greatest of all truths. This is metaphysics going on here, right? What do the gods themselves worship but perfection, the unattainable victory over nature's uncertainty? There are many words for this struggle: order against chaos, structure against dissolution, light against dark, life against death, but they all mean the same thing. The reneg has fallen lame, is distanced from the herd, yet walks on in its wake, seeking the herd's protection. Time will heal or weaken. Two possibilities. But the lame reneg knows naught but stubborn hope, for that is its nature. The eye has seen it and is now close. The prey is strong, but alone. The eye know weakness, like a scent on the cold wind. And it goes on. Hunger wars with stubborn hope. And then the Teblar Karsa Olong says, your new master would harbor that lame beast, would offer it a haven. And Urgal says, you cross a bridge before we have built it, Karsa Orlong. Perfection is an illusion, Sabal said. Mortal and immortal alike are striving for what cannot be achieved. Our new master seems to alter the paradigm, Karsa Orlong, a third force to change forever the eternal war between order and dissolution. A master demanding the worship of imperfection, the Teblar growled. Sabal's head creaked in a nod. Yes. So that's the new paradigm that's being sketched out. And how do things end? At the very culmination of the House of Chains, what we find out is that the Toblaki, that's Karsa, is supposed to be the knight in the House of Chains, but he's not going to be an obedient knight. And then we also find out that the deck of dragons has been decided. Herbert says, do you play with these cards? Lorik says, I don't do that. Play, that is. A master has come to the deck, and that master has just sanctioned the House of Chains. Herbert's eyes widened. Let the gods rail. He or she had to do just that. And then Lorik says, I know. The crippled god is now as bound as every other god. In the game, and so after so long outside it, I wonder if one day he'll come to regret his gambit. So this is why Paran decided on the affirmation. The House of Chains is now a new house, like the House of Shadow that rose again, and it is stuck within the game, this vast play of metaphysical and moral forces that undergird the Malazan narrative universe. And so on that, for now, we end.